They're on headlines. What time's the rugby? Oh, 4:45.
Where did that thought come from?
It's 4:45. You'll see why now.
Yeah, just in time for the rugby.
Stand by. No headlines.
Well, Aubrey, if you can see behind me the iconic Soweto skyline, the two towers, and it's a beautiful day here at the University of Johannesburg. And you can see, perhaps if we take some visuals, the huge queues of people who have come to listen to Professor Thomas Piketty today. And you have to consider that these are South Africans who are coming to a lecture, roughly an hour long, perhaps even more, and they may even miss the rugby today. So there's a lot of fervour around this economist. It's a great honour for South Africa, firstly, to have him in town. He's been quite elusive of late. This economist, Piketty, sort of shot to stardom, especially after his book, Capital in the 21st Century, was translated into English. It became a bestseller on various measurements, the New York Times topping for weeks and weeks and weeks. And you have to consider that this is a very thick book full of economic data. But people are very interested because he's touching on something that's so crucial for our world today. Inequality, so crucial for South Africa, one of the most unequal countries in the world. And he's actually made recommendations for global leaders how to deal with inequality. He's also been willing to make some recommendations this week. Let me bring in my co-anchor here, Devin Murugan, and maybe you can touch on why we're in Soweto.
Oh, thanks very much, Francis. Yeah, indeed. I mean, we've been anticipating today for months now, haven't we? He's finally here in Soweto at the University of Johannesburg. And let's remember that 60 years ago here, the Freedom Charter was adopted by the Congress of the People in 1955. I mean, here's a charter that was aimed at principles for uplifting South Africans, for taking them into democracy. And still, in 2015, we find ourselves in a society facing poverty, facing inequality. So how fitting is it to hear global perceptions, global understandings of poverty from an author and an economist like Thomas Piketty? So very, very fitting indeed for us to hear some of his takes on what, of course, is one of the biggest challenges this country is facing.
And he said, we spoke to him earlier this week, he said that he was very honoured to be here. He grew up knowing about apartheid, knowing about the fall eventually of apartheid, obviously a fan of Nelson Mandela, and willing to come and do the Nelson Mandela Lecture, also willing to accept an honour, an and he actually rejected a few honours, but he took an honorary doctorate from the University of Johannesburg. Let's start at the beginning, though, because there was a lot of anticipation about the arrival of a rock star economist from France to South Africa, especially economists, academics, very excited, but it started off with quite a glitch and a lot of stress. So you were in Cape Town, where he was meant to land. Just take us through that.
Yeah, well, there we were Tuesday evening, rushing down because this famous economist and author was going to grace our shores and our soil. So we get to Cape Town from Johannesburg on Tuesday evening, and of course we were awoken with the news from the Nelson Mandela Foundation, disappointing news that Mr. Piketty wasn't on the plane. And after an hour or two, we finally determined that there was a glitch with his passport. Apparently, there were too little pages, not sufficient enough for immigration officials to allow him on the plane to reach Johannesburg. So there we were waiting for Mr. Piketty, had all our interview preparations in order to interview him. But of course, he didn't pitch up. But then the next day, I think you had the gracious opportunity of actually seeing and speaking to Mr. Piketty. How was that?
So I did. It was wonderful. I'm really impressed with his understanding of what's happening in South Africa. He could have come and spoken about what he studied, the US, the UK and France, but he's actually understood our country. We'll talk a little bit about that interview, but let's go inside now. Now the lecture is scheduled to begin, the proceedings scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock. Let's see what's happening inside the hall there. I'm outside, and from our vantage point there are a lot of people still trying to get into that hall. So I don't know if the proceedings have begun, and I doubt it. Let's go inside, and I'll just give you a layout. On the ground floor, there are about 1,000 seats. Now that is VIP invited guests. You can see earlier it was quite empty, especially at the back, but that hall looks like it certainly has filled up. Okay, proceedings have begun inside. There's going to be a lot of housekeeping, a lot of introductions, all the VIPs who are here, and we'll run through some of their names shortly. Up on the grandstands on the sides, there are invited guests. And what's really interesting is that the University of Johannesburg saying earlier this week that about 500 people said that they are the only people who have read the book, and that's why they should come. But so if you weren't an invited guest, you had to apply, basically. We're going inside again, and hopefully we can see those grandstand seats, and let's listen in and just see what's happening at the moment.
A world-class space and place of growth and of learning, and to a place that is one of great joy, of pride, of inspiration for Sowetans, for South Africans, for Africans, and for our world. Your participation in such extraordinary numbers in this landmark Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture elevate our collective spirit of confidence, of optimism, of hope and resilience as we must face up to the greatest challenge of the 21st century, that of nurturing human societies that are deeply caring, completely inclusive, and significantly more equal. For failure to undertake and succeed in this task will, under our watch, spell the end, as we know it, of nation-states and human societies. And so we gather at a very special place, and may our presence here unite us with those living and deceased who had the courage in June 1976 to raise the flag of freedom, of democracy, of equality, and of human dignity. May our presence also unite us with Enoch Sontonga, who in 1897, at the foothills of this campus, this Soweto campus, wrote with great optimism, with hope, with confidence, and with resolve, Africa's liberation anthem, Nkosi Sikelele Africa, God bless Africa. Welcome to Soweto, welcome to the University of Johannesburg. I thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Professor Rensburg. As has been said, this particular lecture is being broadcast via the SABC throughout the country and indeed in other parts of the world as well. But we'd also like now to particularly acknowledge the following universities who are listening in and watching our proceedings live. And they are University College in Dublin, Polytechnic of Namibia, University of the West Indies, Ibadan University in Nigeria, Lund University in Sweden, the National University of Singapore, the University of Dar es Salaam, and the University of Botswana. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us from whichever parts of the world you are joining us from. I'd now like to call on Afro soul sensation Nomfusi, who is going to render both national anthems for us. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please rise as that is done.
Wosisigeleli Afrika maluphakanyiswa uphando lwayo izwa imithandazo yethu Nkosi sikelela thina lusapho lwayo urena buluka sitshaba sa Yesu ufedise dintwali matshwenye usibuluke
Die diepte van ons Heer, oor ons ewige geperdes van die kranse antwoord gee. Sounds the call to come together and united we shall stand. Let us live and strive for freedom in South Africa, our land.
You may be seated. And thank you so much to Unomfusi and the accompanying artists for that rousing rendition of the South African anthem. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is the chairman of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. As has already been said, he's also the chancellor of the University of Johannesburg. Please welcome academic and writer extraordinaire, Professor Njabulo Ndebele, otherwise known as my boss. Okay.
Good afternoon to you all, distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen who are in this hall, and to all our guests and viewers around the world and the universities that have been listed that are spread across the globe.
On behalf of the Nelson Mandela Foundation's Board of Trustees, I thank you all for attending this 13th Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture. The board, comprising of Nigiwe Bigicha, who reminded us that I'm her boss, Caroline Hamilton, Ahmed Kathrada, Maya Makanji, Irene Menel, Sillo Muloko, Khalima Mutlante, Futi Mtoba, Mampela Rampela, Tokyo Sehwale, and myself, we wish to express our profound gratitude to all who have supported this lecture from the time that it started 13 years ago, and in particular to this particular lecture, which occurs in the second year since our beloved founder's passing. I'm sure all of you feel as I do today, missing Madiba as much as ever and experiencing his presence. Today we also miss Mrs. Gracia Machel, who has faithfully attended lectures over the years, first with Madiba and then on her own when he was no longer able to accompany her. Circumstances do not allow her to be with us today, but I know that she is here in spirit. We are also thinking of Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, who has attended many of our lectures in the past, who is unable to be here today, recovering in Cape Town. We think of him today and wish him well. Many individual expressions of thanks for this lecture are due, and they will be conveyed by our Chief Executive in his closing remarks. But I just want to mention two at the onset, and welcome in particular the Vice Chancellor Aaron Rensburg of the University of Johannesburg. And thank you, Vice Chancellor, for hosting us. Your university provides us with the ideal venue this year. Welcome also Mr. Premier of the Gauteng, Mr. David Makura. We appreciate your presence. Thank you for your support. Vice Chancellor, we are here in Soweto 60 years after the Freedom Charter was adopted here by the Congress of the People in 1955. The Charter defined the struggle for freedom in South Africa in many ways and influenced profoundly the Constitution of the Republic, which underpins our democracy. It articulated a dream for all who live in South Africa, which poverty and inequality are threatening to unravel at this moment. The state, the private sector, and civil society need to find ways of doing things differently if that dream is to be sustained. We look forward to be inspired by our speaker, Professor Thomas Piketty, to keep dreaming and thinking up new and innovative solutions for the future of our country. Professor Piketty, we are deeply honored that you accepted our invitation to deliver the 13th Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture. We welcome you and your wife, Julia, who have visiting us from France to attend this lecture. My board wanted a 2015 annual lecturer who would offer an authoritative voice on the global scourges of poverty and inequality. One who would offer us insight into the conditions of the vast majority of South Africans find themselves in. Someone who could go beyond analysis and share ideas for changing what has become a predatory global economic system with dire consequences for human and other populations, a system that arguably is placing the human project around the globe at risk. One who Nelson Mandela would certainly have wanted us to have on stage today. Last year, my Board of Trustees took a decision to focus the Foundation's dialogue endeavor, which is embedded in our founding document, to focus around these two twin schedules. As a consequence of this, among others, 3 days ago at the University of Cape Town, we announced the Mandela Initiative, a major new intersectoral project designed to create a national conversation to explore ways of shifting societal patternings by doing things differently. My reference to this initiative today, in a sense, is in its own way a kind of launching it as well. This initiative is rooted in 4 defining characteristics that I will now spell out. The first one, inspiration from our founder, Nelson Mandela, for whom poverty and inequality loomed large through his presidency and retirement. In 2005, he said, "Poverty and deprivation in our midst demean all of us. Let us mobilize in one great cooperative national effort the enormous energy of our society in order to overcome and eliminate poverty." The second one, it will be carried by a dynamic partnership engaging the state, civil society, and the private sector. And thirdly, it will draw on deep research and analysis. And on this, I would like to say a few words. This aspect of it is particularly significant from the point of view that the difficult decisions that we have to make in future should be a product of rigorous research and be data-driven. This is particularly important because in order for us to achieve this, the entire system of higher education in South Africa will be galvanized to make a researched input into this initiative. I remember that when I was an undergraduate student in 1974, in my final year in Lesotho, I bought a book entitled The Discarded People by Cosmas Desmond. I read it, and many years later, I had forgotten about it somehow. But it came back with full force when we started hearing about Professor Piketty's book and what it was about. And I went back to this book and discovered, to my illumination and deep concern and interest, just how much the inequality and poverty that we're seeing in this country is in living memory. Because, like many others in this room, we have a personal experience of being moved around the country. And Desmond Cosmas personally visited all the places like Stenkwater, like the Dimbaza, and others that were symbolic, but very much in the news in those days. Some estimates put the figure at 6.5 million people who are shunted around the country. And in particular, from a research perspective, I am interested to know what happened to the people who came from thriving communities, after decades and decades of successful agriculture. One day, an official came and said, "You have to move." And overnight, they became impoverished. I'm interested to know because their land was taken over by those who were favored by the state to take over fertile land and build their lives after that. I would like to know what happened to those people, the beneficiaries of so much from the state, and what happened to those that were thrown away by the state and discarded in the manner that they did. Whatever the outcome of those events, live with us today. If at that time it was legal and legitimate to do those things, it no longer is today. And today we will ask, what are the ethical and moral reasons around which to create wealth and money? Because those reasons, those imperatives are as important as the economics of it all. The last and fourth factor is a commitment to community-level dialogue that is designed to take place all over the country and get South Africans involved in this very massive project since 1994. This then is the context which informed our invitation to Professor Piketty. He has been called the most influential economist in the world for a good reason. A product of the French education system, he got his PhD at the age of 22. He has received honors from many countries, including an honorary doctorate, as you have heard, from the University of Johannesburg just yesterday. His seminal work, Capital in the 21st Century, is an international bestseller. He is read not only by scholars and students, but by journalists, social commentators, activists, and global citizens looking for sustainable solutions to the problem of structural inequalities. And hopefully, in the manner that I've pointed out, we took courage and inspiration from the fact that he and his project drew data covering 3 centuries and over more than 50 countries. Nothing can be more extensive and more rigorous than that. It is against this background that his counsel is sought by governments, universities, and other institutions of the democratic order. He combines deep research and analysis with robust engagement in both theory and policy. And most importantly, he offers unique insight into how we might do things differently. I hope I'm not putting you, Professor Piketty, under pressure by saying that we cannot wait to hear your lecture and welcome you warmly to this esteemed platform. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Piketty.
Thank you for your very warm welcome. Let me first apologize for the fact that my English sounds a lot like French, and I hope this will be okay with you. Let me start by saying how honored and moved I am by being here today for this Nelson Mandela lecture. For everybody from my generation, from around the world, South Africa and Nelson Mandela, of course, have a universal meaning. So I was born in 1971, and when I was a teenager, South Africa was of course, one of the very important countries that I was always hearing about. And when I became an adult in 1989, in Paris, we were commemorating the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. But what was really important, what was going on was elsewhere, was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of apartheid with the liberation of Nelson Mandela in 1990 and the end of apartheid in the following years. And being here today, 25 years later, is something which I find very, very moving and very strong, and I am very honored and grateful for the foundation, for inviting me. Of course, now that we are 25 years after the fall of apartheid, we are all puzzled by the fact that inequality not only is still very high in South Africa, but even in some way has been rising, and in some way income inequality is even higher today than 20 years ago, which is extremely puzzling for all of us, and this is something we want to better understand. And we also know from historical experience that extreme inequality with the kind of levels that we observe in South Africa is not good for development and growth, and it can also lead to violent reactions and violent events, and we all have in mind the very violent episodes in Maracana 3 years ago, and we know from historical experience that if inequality is not addressed through peaceful means and peaceful democratic institution, it's always potentially a source of violence, and of course this can happen again. So what I really would like to do in this lecture is to try to see what we can learn from the historical experience of other countries with inequality in order to better analyze the future opportunities for a country like South Africa, but more generally for the world issue of inequality. So let me say right away, and I will speak more about this, that the fact that inequality today in some dimensions is higher in South Africa than what it was in 20 years ago in terms of concentration of income is partly due to international factors which are not completely, of course, under the control of the South African government. And I will come back to this later, and I think the international community, broadly speaking, has a big responsibility for the situation of inequality in South Africa, in Africa in general, and in the world in general, and some of the solution will have to come from the international community. But that will not be enough just to blame the international factors, and I think there are also deeper reasons for the fact that in terms of reduction of inequality, the South African revolution, so to speak, did not deliver as much as one might have expected. And generally speaking, I would say the general reason is that equality in formal rights and in basic civil rights, even though it is of course very important, the right to move in the country, the right to take all possible occupation, at least in theory, the right to vote. All these formal civil rights are extremely important, but equality in formal rights is not sufficient to reach real equality. So if you want effective rights to move, it's not enough to be formally allowed to go to the other part of the country. If you cannot pay rent or housing to go where the jobs are, in effect the right to move remains limited, very limited right. And more generally, I will argue that we now need to think harder about how to secure effective rights, including right to work for a decent wage, right to good quality education, right to access to property, and finally, and maybe most importantly, right to real economic and political democracy, including sharing of economic power in companies and participatory governments, both in the public and the private sector. So, in this presentation, I'm going to make 3 different points. In the first part, I will first try to put the issue of inequality into an historical perspective and see what we can learn from historical experiences with reduction of inequality in different countries. Then in the second point will be about the solution for reducing inequality in South Africa that we can draw from historical experience. And then the third part of the lecture will be about the global response to inequality and the need for international action. So let me first start with history and the historical perspective. I think it's important because there's a lot of historical amnesia in the world sometimes about inequality, and I think it's important to take this broad historical and comparative perspective. And as a scholar, as an academic, my work has been primarily the work of an historian trying to collect historical data on inequality and wealth. I should stress that this was possible only through a very collective research project. So I started working on the inequality of income and wealth in France about 15 years ago, but then I was very fortunate to find many collaborators in many countries, Tony Atkinson in Britain, who also worked on the case of South Africa, Emmanuel Saez in the US, who also worked on Japan and Canada, Facundo Alvaredo on Argentina and Chile and Mexico, Abhijit Banerjee on India, and I cannot make the complete list, but it's really a very international, global, collective research program that is now continuing. I should stress that we still know too little about inequality, and we know a little bit more than we used to, and I will try to share some of the lessons that we have learned, but we still know too little. We are in the social sciences. There are different ways to interpret history, and our objective is not to come with ready to apply solution or magic bullet, but rather to contribute to a more informed democratic discussion about inequality. And ultimately, the objective is really that everybody, normal citizen, can look at this data, look at the book written from this data and make their own opinion, because these issues are too important to be left to a small group of experts. And I think, it's wrong to believe. Sometimes economists like to pretend that they have built an economic science that is so sophisticated that the rest of the world cannot understand. But of course, this is a big joke. But what's important is not to let economists do that. I think it's important to realize that issues of inequality, income, wealth, capital, public debt are not technical issues. These are issues on which everybody must have an opinion, because ultimately this is what determines political change. So if we look at this historical database that we have collected, probably the most important finding is that we cannot simply rely on market forces and trickle-down mechanism in order to deliver the right level of inequality. Okay, so this very optimistic theory of economic development, which at some point was described as the theory of the Kuznets curve, according to which you have a natural reduction of inequality in advanced stages of development. Well, this theory is just wrong if you take this very broad international perspective that we have taken in our research. In particular, one very important findings is that if you look at the reduction of inequality that happened during the first half of the 20th century in North America, in Europe, or in Asia, you can see that this has nothing to do with a natural process based on market forces. It is due to a large extent to the very violent shocks of World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and most importantly, to the new policies, the new social policies, welfare state policies, the new fiscal policies, progressive taxation, that were finally accepted by the elites after these violent shocks, and also after the Bolshevik Revolution, which put strong pressures on the elite in Western countries to accept reforms which until 1914, until World War I, were refused. Now, that's a very important lesson. In particular, this is particularly striking for my own country, France, to see that until 1914, until World War I, you actually have rising concentration of wealth, and with a level of concentration of wealth which was probably, if anything, higher than a century before or 130 years before under the Ancien Régime, under the French Revolution. And that's very striking for several reasons. First, because at that time, in 1910, 1900, 1914, the French Republican elite, financial, economic, and political elite, were very strongly in a very strong denial of this. And basically they were saying, well, no, this cannot be possible because we have made the French Revolution, so this is enough. You know, we are now a country of equals. We don't have aristocrats anymore. We have equal formal rights. We have the right to move, the right to take any occupation, the right to property, the right to vote, at least for men at that time. And therefore, we are a country of equals. So, for instance, we don't need progressive taxation. And it's very interesting to see that France, you know, France sometimes likes to portray itself as a country of equality. But, you know, there's always a lot of hypocrisy in all these kind of statements about a country of equality, country of opportunity. And, you know, the elites have a lot of imagination for self-serving statements and in order to justify the system from which they benefit. So in the end, France was actually the last country to create an income tax in the summer of 1914, and this was not to pay for education or for schools. This was to pay to go to war with Germany. Okay? And other countries had already created the income tax before, the US in 1913, Britain in 1908, Prussia, Japan, Sweden in 1880, 1890. France was the very last one among developed countries to create an income tax. What's interesting is to understand why. It's because there was this feeling among the elite that, well, we have done the French Revolution, we don't have aristocrats, we are a country of equals, so we don't need progressive taxation. Britain, of course, will need progressive taxation because they have all this aristocracy with this queen and this concentrated land, so they should create progressive tax right away. But in France, we don't need it because we've done the French Revolution. So that's interesting, first for historical reason, but also because we can see that, you know, the elite have a lot of imagination to justify their position. It's also interesting because this failure of the French Revolution, which is sort of the bourgeois revolution par excellence, which gave equal rights, you know, before 1789, before the French Revolution, a small group of aristocrats, which were about 1% of the population, had a very privileged right regarding the fiscal system, regarding political right. There were also restrictions to mobility within the country and to the kind of occupation you can take depending on your social origins. So you know, there were privileges in the country, and at that time the hope during the French Revolution is that if we have equal rights to take all occupation, to move, equal right to property, then this should be enough to bring a country of equals. And the fact that it didn't work this way, and that in fact over the course of the 19th century and in the early 20th century, we get to a concentration of wealth that is in some ways even higher than under the Ancien Regime, is very interesting because it shows probably one of the deep reasons that I try to explain in my research is that the fact of being a republic rather than a monarchy, you know, I'm very happy to be in a republic, by the way, but the fact of being in a republic rather than a monarchy doesn't really change the deep economic mechanisms through which the concentration of wealth is working. And in particular, the fact that all over the 19th century, you have a rate of return to capital that is markedly higher than the growth rate of the economy, 4%, 5%, 6% per year for the new capital investment in the manufacturing sector as compared to a growth rate of 1%, 2% per year. Well, this gap between the two can explain to a large extent why we continue with a very large concentration of wealth until World War I. So it's only very violent shocks which occurred in the 20th century which finally convinced the elite to accept a number of fiscal and social reforms that were not adopted before. Now, I think this is of interest to South Africa because, you know, of course, I don't want to compare the French Revolution and the South African Revolution. It's completely different context, and in a way, you know, the inequality regime that existed under apartheid was much more oppressive and violent than Ancien Regime in France. The group that had more rights than the rest of the population, namely the whites, was much bigger. You know, it was not 1% of the population, it was 10, 15%, so that's it's more difficult to deal with a situation like this than with one person. The difference in color of skin is also important, because when everybody is white in France, you can sort of forget a couple of generations later who comes from what group, which is more difficult with the color of skin. No, but it's a trivial remark, but it makes a big difference in the long run in order to move ahead and solve this kind of situation. And finally, the repression of basic rights, which was happening under apartheid, was much more violent, with restrictions to mobility, and we had a reference to this, and expulsion, and the very strong territorial discrimination, which did not really exist in France in the 18th century, and which in some ways looked more like the kind of serfdom systems that we had a couple of centuries before. So, the challenges, the system from which South Africa comes from is, in a way, a much more oppressive inequality system than France under the Ancien Regime, and that's another reason why formal equal rights is not sufficient to bring equality. So one of the lessons I draw from this historical part of my lecture is that we need more than formal equal rights to move, rights to take occupation. That's important, but that's not enough. So let me now turn to the issue of inequality in South Africa today, and what kind of response to reduce inequality we can think of. First, what do we know about the level of inequality in South Africa, how this has changed since the fall of apartheid, and how does this compare to other countries? We know too little, in particular regarding wealth concentration, but everything we know suggests an unusually high level of inequality, higher than what we observe pretty much everywhere else in the world. So just to take one number, which I find particularly striking, if we use the South African income tax data together with national accounts, household survey, and we do the same for other countries, we find that the share of total income going to the top 10% income earners in South Africa currently, right now, is between 60 and 65% of total income for the top 10%. Just to make comparison, in Brazil, using similar data, we are between 50 and 55%. In the US, we are between 45 and 50%, and in most European countries, we are between 30 and 35%. So with 60 to 65, just to remember these orders of magnitude, South Africa is really at the top of the class, so to speak, and is in a way way out other experience that we can see of. Now, if we try to explain this, some people say, well, that's because we have very high unemployment. And certainly, high unemployment is a big problem to solve and to address in South Africa. But I don't think this can explain, I think, this extremely and unusually high level of inequality. I think unemployment is more a symptom of inequality, unequal skills, unequal distribution across the territories, where people cannot move to where the jobs are and have not access to the right skills. But this in itself cannot explain such a high level of income concentration. Just to take an example, there are other countries in the world, unfortunately, where you have very high unemployment. In Spain or Greece, you have also 25% rate of unemployment, and you don't have that kind of level of income inequality. You still have 30 to 35% of total income to the top 10% as compared to 60 to 65 in South Africa. So even if the data is not perfect, I think it's very clear that the extreme level of inequality that we have in South Africa is much more than just unemployment. It has to do certainly with the legacy of the apartheid. In particular, it is striking to see that what's really different in South Africa as compared to other countries is the top 10% share. If you take the top 1% share, it's not so different from the US today, but if you take the top 10% share, then it's really higher in South Africa. So this really suggests that what's specific is that you have a relatively large group in the country, around 10%, which is very far away from the rest of the population. And of course, this group historically has been predominantly or almost exclusively white, and even today, if you look at the data we have especially within the top 5% or top 1%, it will be up to 80% white. So things have changed a little bit, but we are still very much with this same structure of racial inequalities that we used to have. So now, how can we make progress? So let me make clear that I am not, I'm not here to give lessons to South Africa. I'm trying to see what we can learn from historical experience. Certainly, the international context has played a role in rising inequality in South Africa since the 1990s. Let me mention a number of reasons. Certainly financial deregulation, which has happened over in the world in the past 25 years, has contributed to rising inequality. More generally, the fall of communism around 1990 has opened the way for a new era of unlimited faith in self-regulated markets, and in some cases this has clearly gone too far. Financial deregulation is one example, and this has contributed to the rise of financial fragility, and which eventually has contributed to the financial crisis of 2008. More generally, if you have globalization without proper regulation, globalization in itself can be a powerful force to reduce inequality at the world level. But if you don't have proper regulation at the same time, in particular regarding taxation, this can contribute to rising inequality. Also, rising commodity price, of course, has contributed to rising top income shares in South Africa. But it will not be enough just to blame these international factors. I think there are really domestic solutions to the inequality in South Africa. So, as I already said, I think there are at least 4 areas of rights where we need to turn to a policy of effective rights. Rights to labor, work for a decent wage, right to high quality education, right to access to property, and right to economic and political democracy. So let me just say a bit more about these 4 rights. Regarding right to work for a decent wage, I think the discussion that South Africa is having right now about the introduction of a national minimum wage is extremely important, and I think that from the historical and comparative experience we have, in my view, if we are able to find the right level for the national minimum wage, then definitely South Africa could and should introduce a national minimum wage. There are countries in the world, not only in the rich world, but also emerging countries like Brazil, who have a national minimum wage, who were able to find the right level for the national minimum wage, although these are much bigger countries than South Africa, 200 million inhabitants, a lot of geographical disparity, and I think South Africa should be able to find the right level for the national minimum wage, and this is a way to avoid situation of extreme exploitation of low-skilled workers, particularly in areas where they have limited opportunity to move. Now, this in itself is not going to solve the key problem, which is the inability to access higher paying jobs. And so here the second important effective right that needs to be strengthened is the right to high quality education, together with the right with adequate public infrastructure, including transportation infrastructure. So regarding public education, I think it is fair to say that the quality of public primary education and junior secondary education that is available to the most disadvantaged group in this country is not satisfactory, and that this should be a national priority, and a lot of progress could be made in this direction. So I understand that many people, in particular many business leaders that I have met in recent days, are very skeptical about the capacity of the government to deliver this. But on the other hand, I think there's no other option than to try to improve the functioning and to contribute to pay the tax that we need in order to finance this public sector of education. There's no other strategy. The strategy according to which we could do it through privatizing the education system, the health system, and let the business sector do it, I think will not work. I think what has worked in history in order to have sustainable and equitable growth is to have a well-functioning public education and health system, and South Africa should go in this direction. The third effective right, which I want to stress, is the right to access to property. So that's probably one of the more complicated rights, because of course it involves very difficult and sensitive issues, including land reform. Let me just say that if we take a broad international historical perspective, we see in many countries in history much more ambitious land reforms than what we have seen in South Africa since the end of the apartheid. I think it's fair to say, or at least many observers have noted, that the black economic empowerment strategies, which were mostly based on voluntary market transactions at market values, were not that successful at spreading the wealth and at limiting the extreme concentration of wealth from which we start in South Africa. So I think we need to think again about more ambitious land reform. I also think that, like many other countries, but maybe probably even more than other countries, South Africa will benefit from increased transparency about wealth and about who owns what in South Africa. And I think it is very difficult to have a reasonable democratic conversation about wealth with so little information. So in particular, people talk about BEE policy and their impact, but in fact there's really very little data on wealth. That's partly because access to the estate tax data is extremely difficult, to say the least, in South Africa. So there is an estate tax, but it's very difficult to know how many taxpayers transmitted wealth between 1 million, 2 million rands, 10 million, 20 million rands year after year. And most importantly, even if this data was available, this would be only information about wealth at death, and wealth of the living is even more interesting than wealth at death in a way. And I think it will be important and absolutely possible for South Africa to introduce an annual tax on net wealth, a progressive annual tax on net individual wealth, even if it comes with very low tax rate to begin with, say 0% below 1 million rands in wealth, 0.1% between 1 and 10 million, and 0.5% above 10 million. I'm just putting numbers so that people have an idea. I think even with relatively low tax rates such as this one, the big advantage of an annual tax on wealth is that it will produce democratic transparency about wealth, and we would know more about who owns what in South Africa and how this is changing over time. And I think it's very important in a country to be able to look year after year at how the different social groups and the different wealth groups are doing, and how they are benefiting or not benefiting from growth and development. And if we don't have this kind of public information, then this is what gives way to very extreme statements from one way or another, from both sides, and it makes it very difficult to come to reasonable and peaceful solutions. So I think, I understand that many people in the business community might be against that, but in the end, in the long run, I think it's in the interest of the business community to promote transparency about wealth, because if we don't have if you refuse transparency, it must be that there's something to hide. So that's not good. In order to build trust in a country, I think it's very important to have that kind of transparency about income and wealth dynamics. And finally, the last and fourth effective right, which I would like to stress, has to do with economic and political democracy. I think it's important in South Africa, like in other countries in the world, to have a new discussion about worker participation in companies, participatory governance. There are many countries in the world, including countries that are doing very well in terms of economic efficiency and export and competitiveness, like Sweden and Germany, where workers have a strong power in the board of companies. So in Sweden, you have 1/3 of the seats in board of companies that go to worker. In Germany, it's up to 1/2. And apparently, this does not prevent them from producing good products and exporting all over the world. So, in my country, in France, for a long time, employers and business people were completely against it. Well, they are still against it, but the difference is that 2 years ago there was a law saying, okay, now there's going to be one employee representative out of 12 board members, so that's much less than in Sweden than in Germany. But because everybody was telling employers in France was, look, this is what they do in Germany, and German firms are doing better than French firms. So why you don't want workers on board? In the end, maybe it's a way to involve workers in the strategy of the company. So instead of just fighting, you can have effective discussion about the strategy of the company, and sometimes this can also be a way to promote more long-run strategy than just short-term maximization of profits. Now, let me turn to the third and final part of this lecture, which has to do with the global response to inequality, because I think it's clear that, South Africa cannot solve all inequality problems in the world alone, and there are many issues for which the rich countries, in particular countries in the north, have a huge responsibility, in particular in order to promote global financial transparency and fight against tax havens. And more generally, it is clear that countries in the north have a huge historical responsibility for inequality in the world today and poverty in many southern countries. Europe has a direct responsibility for the existence of the apartheid in the first place, and more generally, the apartheid system was simply one extreme version of a form of colonial inequality structure that you see in French colonies, in British colonies, all across colonial history. So, the French Revolution, again, was very strong in terms of abstract principles. Article 1 of the Declaration of Rights of 1789 was saying that all men should have equal rights, that social distinction should be based only on common utility. But in practice, the French Republic went on to develop, one of the worst colonial empires in history. And the French revolutionaries said in 1792 that they wanted to abolish slavery, but then the government of France under Napoleon and under the monarchies reinstated slavery, which was finally abolished in 1848. And when Haiti took seriously the French Revolution and decided that they would be independent, and decided to be independent in 1804, as you probably know, what happened is that not only France was very unhappy, but France said in the end, in 1825, okay, you're going to be independent, but you're going to pay the price for this. And there's going to be a large compensation to the slave owners, to us, for you being free. So what happened is that there was this very large public debt that was imposed on Haiti, which Haiti had to reimburse until the middle of the 20th century. And all along the 19th century, Haiti is paying interest payment to France as a compensation for the fact that the slave owners are not getting income from their slaves. And, there is so much historical amnesia. We forget about these things, and when Haiti started to ask for compensation again a few years ago, in 2004, and when they were commemorating the 200th anniversary, the French government said, okay, we won't go to Haiti for the anniversary because we don't want to hear about this compensation. So, this is just an example to say that, historical amnesia and the responsibility of northern countries in today's inequality situation in the world is enormous. Now, if we look at the future, because just talking about the past is not enough, although in this case I think it is still time for compensation and for reimbursing the debt that was paid from Haiti to France. But if we look at the future and from a more global perspective, I think it is clear that Europe and North America have a strong responsibility if we want to encourage financial transparency in the world. And, I think Europe and North America should stop having a double language with Africa, which is that on the one hand, they always give lessons about good governance and transparency, etc., and on the other hand, their own multinational companies and their own wealthy citizens are the very ones who are benefiting from financial opacity, and they are nothing at all about it. They are doing nothing at all about it. So there's really a double language, which I think is absolutely terrible. I think, what Africa needs is not foreign aid. Africa is not asking for help. What Africa needs is to have an international legal system that allows African countries to make multinational companies and wealthy citizens pay their fair tax. And this is what Europe and North America should now offer. So I think there are at least two concrete proposals that the northern countries should on which they should make substantial progress. First one is that there should be a lot more transparency about how much multinational companies from Europe and North America are paying in tax when they are doing business in Africa. And so the European Parliament sort of voted a text about this 2 years ago, but it's not sufficient information disclosure, and in addition, the information is actually very difficult to access. So, it's a very strange system where the companies are supposed to disclose information, but in the end, it's so well hidden in remote reports that are not accessible freely online that nobody can get the information. And in any case, the requirements that were made in terms of information disclosure were completely insufficient to compute what we would like to compute in order to impose better behavior on this company. Now, the second proposal, which I think is even more important, is that Europe and North America should accept the creation of a world financial register on financial assets, which will be a central repository for financial assets, so that we will know who owns what financial assets all across the world. Now, some of you might react by saying, oh, but this is completely utopian. How could we do that? Well, let me tell you that, in fact, we already have this kind of central repository for assets, because that's useful for private companies to know who owns them. Now you don't have paper titles for a long time, so it's all electronic titles, and you need someone to keep track of who owns what in the world. Otherwise, you could have different people who claim that they own the same company, which will create a number of problems. So you have central repository who keep this information, but these are private institutions. These are not public institutions. So they are called Clearstream or Eurostream in Europe. They are called National Depository Trust Corporation in the US. So these are private corporations who are offering these services to financial companies so that they keep track of who owns them. But these private institutions do not collaborate with the public institution, and in particular do not send their information to tax administration. So I think it is time that governments in Europe and North America in particular, but all across the world, take control of this private depository institution and create a public world registry of financial assets. I think, first, that would be useful also for financial regulation. When we try to monitor a world financial crisis and nobody has any idea of who owns what in the world, this creates problem also just for macroeconomic policy and basic financial regulation. But most importantly, this will be important for taxation policy, because this is what would allow the different countries to better know who owns what in their own country and to impose minimal taxation. Now, this is possible. In particular, the European Union and the United States are about to negotiate a new transatlantic treaty to reduce tax on trade. But, the bottom line is that there's no tax on trade anymore. So there's not much to do in this treaty. And that will be a unique opportunity to tell to the world, okay, now we're really going to be serious to fight tax havens. And that will be very important for everybody in the world, but particularly for Africa, because if we take the existing estimates of what fraction of the world financial assets are held in tax havens, then the fraction is much bigger in African countries or for the Middle East than it is for Europe or in France. The best estimates we have for Africa is that between 30 and 50% of financial wealth is held offshore. So clearly, this is in effect a way to take away from Africa some of the resources that are necessary for development. So again, just to conclude, I don't think what needs Africa is a new form of foreign aid, which in any case, aid flows. Let me also remind to you this basic fact, which is that all aid flows going to Africa are less than the official outgoing profit flows going out of Africa and that are paid to owners, in particular in Europe and North America. Now, these are the official flows. Okay? So if we think of the unofficial flows going to tax havens. Again, the estimates we have are that these are at least of the same order of magnitude, so the total will be vastly larger than at least twice as large than the aid flow. So again, what we need really for the future is not so much to talk about aid, but simply to change the international legal system so that African governments can conduct a tax policy without being always threatened, sometimes by their own business community, to go away and not contribute to the common good. And, I understand some people today are saying, okay, but, we could just organize the system through voluntary donation and charitable giving. And, I understand that people who have a lot of money would like just to decide how much they want to contribute to such or such project. But, it's very difficult to organize a society like this. It's very difficult to organize a society where thousands of people just want to decide for themselves how much they want to contribute to the public good. So we need a legal system, in particular an international legal system that allows African countries to develop a fair tax system that's asking to those at the top at least as much as those in the middle and at the bottom, which is not the case as of today. Let me now, as a general conclusion, try to be optimistic about the future. I said, there are big challenges ahead, but there are solutions, and there are peaceful solutions to address inequality. Let me be also optimistic about South Africa and Africa. I was making this comparison with the South African Revolution, the French Revolution. South Africa and France have a lot in common. In a way, today they almost have the same size. The population of France is 60 million. The population of South Africa is 55 million. So it's almost the same size. But a big difference is that France has had a stagnation of population for a very long time. So the population of France was already 40 million a century ago and 30 million at the time of the French Revolution. So, it's almost the same country, almost the same families, almost the same. Whereas South Africa has gone through an enormous population growth, and it's a very young and dynamic and energetic country. And South Africa in 1910, at the time of the creation of the South African Union, had 6 million inhabitants, including 5 million black and colored and 1 million white. And now we have gone from 10 to 55 with 5 white and 50 blacks and colored. So this is not the same country. This is when you multiply the size of a country by 10, and the population as of 1980, in the early 80s, was around 30 million. So the country has gone from 30 to 55. Now, these are enormous challenges. So when we talk about public infrastructure, public education, it's difficult to keep up with this. It's difficult, but in the long run, I think this is an asset. I think the youth of South Africa and the energy of the population of South Africa is an asset. I think it's better to have positive population growth, well, maybe not enormous population growth, but positive, rather than negative population growth. And, when I see Africa, European countries who have negative population growth, I think, for the future, that's very frightening in terms of inequality and in terms of just what these countries are going to become with the aging. And some countries like France are doing now a bit more children than others like Germany. Germany is a bit more open to migrants recently, but then you have many countries in Eastern Europe, they don't want children and they don't want migrants either. So, they're going to disappear. And now South Africa and Africa are not going to disappear. And I think if these challenges that we have referred to today are addressed adequately, I think Africa and South Africa are the future of the world. And so let me conclude this. And thanks a lot for your attention.
Another warm round of applause for Professor Piketty, ladies and gentlemen. You have indeed, sir, given us plenty of food for thought and given us very clear policy direction and interventions which can be taken to reverse the inequality that South Africa has. We, of course, remember, as you spoke to us this afternoon, that we hold the dubious honor of being the opening chapter of your book. The things that you have reminded of us today will help us to ensure that we never have to endure another Marikana again. Let it move from policy to action. Professor Piketty, we thank you for your time and your inputs this afternoon. Let me now call on Selo Hatang, the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Thank you very much, Prof. I think having spent 3 days with you, I can sort of show off a bit of my French and say those who don't know French call you Thomas, but those who know French call you Thomas. And I also learned 2 more words, Prof, and I'm again just showing off that I should have said bonjour at the beginning and to say merci beaucoup. I think you'll agree with me that Professor Piketty has stimulated our minds and challenged us to action. We invited him to deliver the 13th annual lecture because he is someone who speaks to both scholarly and popular discourses, someone who combines deep research and analysis with robust engagement in both theory and policy. Most importantly for us, he's making vital contributions in addressing what have become critical questions for the Nelson Mandela Foundations. And these are, how can we overcome oppressive patterns of poverty and inequality? How can we do things differently in order to ensure that all who live in South Africa can enjoy the fruits of freedom? Professor Piketty, you have not disappointed us today at all. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your challenge. You are not punting a blueprint, nor are you offering a silver bullet, but you are giving us hope that we can do things differently, that there are strategies for effecting meaningful change, that there are sustainable solutions to intractable problems confronting us. You have affirmed today what you articulated in the introduction of your book, Capital in the 21st Century. Beware of those who have all the answers. Follow those who are asking the right questions, and push hard for more transparency. I tried to count how many times you mentioned the word transparency today. I think I lost count at about 6. And that more access to information and relevant data is critical. That open governance is good governance. Freedom of information is a founding concept, you'll be happy to know, for the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And we'll keep working hard to promote it in our country. Thank you for reminding us of this crucial element, Prof. In the audience today is a young woman, a student of economics, who soon after the last annual lecture recommended Professor Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century to one of my colleagues. I'd like you to please help me as I acknowledge Sonia Palatse. You were absolutely right. Thank you for your inspiration, and we hope that the oldies who are here can hear that we listen to young people, because I think she is about 22 and she recommended this book. So it means that we need to be doing more. I know you never reveal a woman's age, but I've got the mic, so I thought I should take care of it. So we read the book and felt the thrill of understanding in fresh ways the global and historical context within which South Africa's struggle against poverty and inequality is unfolding. We heard Professor Piketty's call not to allow the past and the present to drag the future down with their terrible weight. In fact, right at the end, he says, of his book, he says, the past will devour the future if we are not careful. We were moved by his reminder to listen closely to the ghosts of those who are still to be born. Please note Prof's call. This call that I just told you about came right at the end of the book. And I'm saying this to prove, Nikiwe, that I'm not one of those who are claiming to have read the book. And I need to tell you that we have about 1,000 public participants today in the audience. And this number, you had to justify why you had to come to the lecture. So people in the field which says, why should you be accepted? About 500 of them wrote there, I must be the only one who read that book. So every now and then my colleague Lee Davies, who deals with accreditation, would burst out laughing. So when you ask him, why are you laughing? He says, no, I've just seen another unique first one to have read the book. If only they knew that they are number 499. Professor Piketty, be assured that the foundation will be using your work for many more years to come. In his speech earlier, Professor Ndebele mentioned the Nelson Mandela Initiative, which we launched recently at UCT. It's going to be one of our flagship programs for the next 3 years. We hope that this project will respond to Prof's call that we remember the forgotten people. We will make sure that the initiative engages with your work as the process unfolds. And I will feel free to call on you whenever a need arises. And I'd like to remind you that Madiba once said, don't call me, I'll call you. But you are welcome to call us also. When you see that we are not following on what you've asked us to do, please feel free to call. It remains for me now to thank the people who made this possible today. The University of Johannesburg, thank you for hosting us so elegantly. I think they deserve it. They deserve it because they have many firsts today. For the first time in the history of the annual lecture, the 13th one, we have the youngest speaker sitting at 44 years old. I must tell you, I made a mistake of telling Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke your age. So he then turned to me and said, how old are you? So I gave him my age, and he said, oh, so he's your contemporary. So I'm not sure what it means. We will have a sidebar at the end, Chief Justice, just to understand what it meant. Another first is that in the history of the annual lecture, we always sit at about 200 public participants. This time we're sitting at 1,000, just over 1,000 public participants. Another big first is that the lecture always hovers around 1,000 people in the audience, sitting in the audience. This time we're sitting just over 2,000 people sitting here. And of course, the biggest first is that we were competing with the rugby and we're still victorious. I'd like to also thank my Board of Trustees. I'd like to thank you for your wisdom and unstinting support. Prof, thank you very much for your support. Always, I know when I look behind me or in front of me, you're there. Thank you very much. The SABC, thank you for working with us as always, to get the lecture out to bigger audiences than we can fit in any auditorium. The biggest thank goes to people who made it possible for Piketty actually to physically be here. And all of you know why I say that. I was saying that a couple of days ago that he knows numbers. He can tell you about billions and zillions, but he got almost tripped by 2 pages. So the number 2 is cursed for Professor Piketty. So I'd like to thank the French ambassador, Ambassador Beber. Thank you very much for your help. Trevor Manuel. Ntate Trevor Manuel, thank you very much for your help. The DG of Home Affairs, Ntate Aplen, in his absence, thank you very much for your help. Deputy Minister Butima Namela, the calls that were made, just to tell you how serious this matter was, were made between the hours of 10 o'clock at night until the next day. So I'm to blame if he didn't sleep, because Ntate Manuel made calls through the night to make sure that the speaker comes. And I would also like to thank the many South African officials and public representatives who worked together to overcome Professor Piketty's challenge of 2 pages, as I said. I thought I should mention it again. It's important, the number. Thank you to our many sponsors and funders, including AngloGold Ashanti, Audi, VW, and I'm told that the cars that you see there are very compliant from VW. Brand South Africa, Coca-Cola, Doe and Carolyn Stein, Nashua Central, ABSA, Rand Merchant Bank, Rupert and Rothschild, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and Vodacom. I must tell you that when Professor Piketty walked in the room, he looked at one of the sponsors there and he saw the logo of Rosa Luxemburg. He said, "I find this fascinating. You're working with Rosa Luxemburg." So it means that they are good guys for us to work with. To the staff of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, to all of you, I say a big, big thank you. I wish I could read out the names of all 22 staff members who made this possible today, but safe to say that the communications and outreach team, I'd like to thank you, single you out, and thank you very much for having done the work that you did. You have indeed done us proud. To Nikiwe Bikicha, our host, you were fantastic. Thank you very much. Lastly, but certainly not least, to say thank you to all of you for attending today and for watching on television and the internet, especially those campuses, different campuses that were mentioned, who joined us today. Ultimately, it is with you, because of you, and it is with you that the success of this lecture will continue. And again, the success was measured with the long queues that we had outside. So I'd like to say again, Rea Leboga. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. At this stage, I'd like to call on our artist for the day, who's going to come and serenade us with some music to come and give us 2 items. Just to say that in the middle of the second item, our honored guests will then vacate the stage. If you can please remain seated. Do not move, just remain seated. If you can please remain seated. So the artist...
They're coming to you live from the University of Johannesburg, Soweto campus. A buzz today. You've just seen Selo Hatang, the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation, thanking UJ for hosting the 13th Annual Nelson Mandela Lecture and saying it was elegant. It was very elegant indeed, well attended, and the audience was participating today. The man of the moment, French economist Thomas Piketty, a world-renowned expert basically on inequality. And a lot of applause, a standing ovation at the end, but a lot of applause when he spoke about the need for transparency around the assets that are held in South Africa. Who owns what land, for example? We know that income inequality in South Africa is very high. We are in one of the most unequal countries in the world. 60%, he says, of income going to the top 10%. But beyond income, actual wealth, actual assets, pretty obscure, and really a lot of applause. I'm joined by economics editor Thandeka Pule, and just your impression. You were in the audience.
I think it was riveting, and it was an enormous pleasure and an honor for the SABC to bring this special broadcast to almost 20 African countries today. And it throws wide open the question of what the benefits of society are and who they are owned by and how they are shared. And that is a story and an issue not just for South Africa alone, but for the entire continent. And I was particularly intrigued by Piketty's prescription for South Africa, which had 4 main points. And the first one is access to quality jobs and decent work. And he said that we should consider a well-calibrated minimum wage. And the second part was quality education. You know, Francis, we've made a lot of strides with access to education, but we have battled to bring quality education to ordinary children. And he says in his book that education is a great equalizer, and if we can use this ladder of education to equalize the stakes in society between the different classes, then we will be a long way. He also talks about infrastructure, the need for powerful, good public infrastructure that can be accessed by the poor, and also, of course, his prescription on taxation, which is the most controversial.
Well, I'm pretty glad because he arrived in South Africa saying that he was here to learn. But obviously these academics all want to pick Piketty's brain. And at least he did give those prescriptions. I think that was really valuable, like you say, around education. And he wants a wealth tax. And you say controversial, but he would like to, he did say it would help transparency to collect who owns what, basically.
Yes, he attacked the opaqueness of how we account for wealth, particularly the invisibility of wealth in South Africa. As you have said, Francis, we are one of the most unequal societies in the world, if not the most unequal. And 60% of the country's output and what we create goes to the top 10%. And surely that is unsustainable. He argued passionately in the beginning of his speech that such levels of inequality lead to violence.
Well, thank you very much, Thandeka, and thank you to you, Jay. It was really elegantly hosted. The University of Johannesburg giving Thomas Piketty an honorary doctorate, which he accepted. Now consider that he rejected other honors in France. He accepted this, and Thandeka speaking to the Vice-Chancellor earlier, saying that what they really enjoy about Piketty is that he's not only an academic looking at the data, but an activist dealing with something so crucial in South Africa, in the world today, inequality. So that's it from us. We cross back to studio. That's a wrap from UJ campus in Soweto.